Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Now if you've been subscribed for a while, then you'll know that a few weeks back I made a beautiful pair of Renaissance pants. I love these pants and they're truly everything I have ever wanted in a pair of pants. Unfortunately, I don't think I could wear them in public without being pointed at, laughed at, and ridiculed. So in today's video I'm going to strive to make some pairs of pants that I can wear in public, specifically some pairs of 1940s inspired shorts. And typically on this channel I use self-drafted patterns or vintage patterns that you can no longer get, which is very frustrating for everyone. But for a change, today I'm going to be following a reproduction pattern that was released by Simplicity a few years ago. It is number 8654, and as of the time I'm filming this, this is still a pattern you can get at most Joann's and anywhere Simplicity patterns are sold. I've had this pattern in my stash for a while and really wanted to follow it because it looks like the perfect pair of 1940 shorts. And this video is sort of a making of tutorial vlog review hybrid. I do have a lot of footage of me actually constructing them, and I do try to talk through the process pretty thoroughly, but I don't necessarily follow the pattern perfectly. That is a warning for those of you who have not been to my channel before, though I always strive to make the best possible garment I can that doesn't always involve following instructions. But if you're wondering whether or not you should buy this pattern, if you're trying to follow it, if you're trying to make something similar, or if you just want to see me go on an adventure to make two pairs of shorts, then this is definitely the video for you. So I hope you will stick around and keep on watching and enjoy! Alright, so I unfurled my pattern and I roughly cut out the pieces that I need to cut from fabric. This was surprisingly easy to do. It was very easy to locate the pieces and also cut them out because there really isn't that much tissue for this pattern. I got the tissue laid out on my muslin and then I cut it out. I ended up cutting out the size 16. I'm sort of between sizes, but from what I've heard, this pattern runs large. Hopefully I'm recalling that correctly. And it's also simple enough that it'd be pretty easy to just make in addition to the sides if it ends up being too small. No matter which size you cut from this pattern, the pleats are in the same position, so it doesn't really matter which size I cut out in terms of their positioning. Now that everything is cut out, I have to go through and cut some notches. Some of the notches I don't think are really crucial, like the notches at the crotch seam. It's pretty self-explanatory which seams get sewn together there, but for the waistband the notches mark the center front as well as the center back because there's a side closure, so for that it is a little bit more crucial. I also have the pocket piece over here which I haven't cut out of fabric just because I'm not going to faff around with pockets on a mock-up. I'm probably not going to have too many comments on assembling the mock-up because we'll be going through it all in a little bit more detail on the final garment. Alright, so a couple days have actually passed. The day I was working on this, I thought I broke my foot, and that sort of put a pin in getting work done on this, but I'm back. I made a mock-up, and I then butchered my mock-up. So the first fitting with this, without any alterations, was actually pretty true to size. I think this is the first reproduction pattern and commercial pattern I've used ever that doesn't run extremely large. So I would say if you're making this and trying to avoid any alterations, definitely make the size for your largest measurement and then alter it from there. So because I made the size for my waist measurement assuming it would run large through the hips, it actually ended up being too tight. Because they have a sloped appearance, there was actually quite a bit of room over the largest part of my hips, but right below my waist, kind of the 3 inches below my waist, it was straining a lot. So the fix I did for this was just slashing the material and then adding this wedge that goes from nothing at the waistline to about a 1/2 inch over the point where it was too tight, and then it actually goes down to about 1.5 inches at the bottom edge. So what this did is it provided more room in that area that I needed it. And once you have that 1/2 inch spread across both sides as well as the back panels, which I did this on as well, you have an extra 2 inches of room in that area. So after making this change, it fit pretty well, but I just found that it wasn't super flattering. It looked almost like I had taken a smaller size of this and altered it really poorly just by adding extra seam allowance to the side edges, because for this size, whether you're making a size 12 or a size 20, the pleats are in the same point and they're very close to the crotch, and I found it made me look quite wide because there was so much unpleated material on either side. So I decided to make another change, and that change is just slashing the panel and adding 3/4 of an inch here before where the pleats start next to the crotch, and then removing 3/4 of an inch on the opposite side of the pleats so the pleats sit 3/4 of an inch farther away from the inseam or the center of the body. And I did this on the back as well. And then while I was at it, even though the waistline fit pretty well, I did decide to add just a 1/4 inch to the waist at 2 spots as well, and I carried that alteration onto the waistband. So this is what my finished pattern looks like. You can see where I have taken it in. You can kind of see the wedge that I added right here, and then this is the 3/4 inch addition that I ended up making, and I just used excess tissue I had from the margins of the pattern to make this alteration so the pattern still looks relatively intact. And these changes were all made by adding to the pattern, not taking from it, so I could easily remove these alterations in the future and restore it to its original size. Actually, the only change I can't make to it is that I ended up cutting the crotch to be in line with one of the larger sizes just because I found it was a little bit tight there, which is probably to be expected since I'm relatively tall. So those are the changes I made. It might seem like a lot of changes, but they were all pretty easy to make, and none of them are going to alter the construction. So if you're watching this trying to figure out or get more ideas on how these pants go together, the process is still going to be exactly the same when it comes to pleating them and everything. The pleats are just going to be farther away from the center line of the body because that's what I thought was more flattering. So with that being said, I can remove the pins from my mock-up and dispose of it and get to work on making the real garment or garments, because now I'm pondering making 2 pairs. Everything has now been cut out. I cut out the short pieces as well as the waistband and the pocket pieces. The pocket piece is cut from 4 layers of muslin because you need 2 layers for each pocket, and I'm making 2 pairs of shorts. I did decide to make 2 pairs because I wanted to try this out with 2 very different fabrics. They're both relatively heavyweight fabrics, but the denim I'm using has some stretch to it, and I've cut the pieces on the grain so the stretch will be going horizontally across the body and probably provide a tighter fit around the hips, though it will also be a more forgiving fit because it will have a little bit of elasticity to it. Then the second fabric I've cut this out of is a very thick cotton twill that feels almost like a canvas. It's so heavy. So I've gone through and cut all of the notches, though a lot of these aren't going to end up being necessary because of the alterations I've made. And the next step is just going to be transferring things like the buttonhole placement as well as the pleat markings onto the fabrics. Alright, so when it comes to marking these pleats, I'm just going to lay the tissue paper on top of the right side of the fabric, and then I'm going to pin the tissue to the fabric just about 1 inch away from the first pleat that I'm going to mark. And then I'm going to fold the pattern back on that pleat line, revealing the material underneath it. Like so. And then I'm going to take a ruler and my water-soluble marking pen. I can link the ones that I use down below. I've had really good luck of these coming out of white fabric. They'll always do a test first. And then I'm just going to mark the pleat line, and then I'm going to fold the fabric on the next marking and use a pattern weight to help keep it creased there, and then just repeat that process. You could also fold the pattern down this way and just mark the bottom point of each pleat and then mark the top point and connect them after the tissue's been removed, but I find this is just as easy to do. And a little bit faster because then you don't have to connect them at the end. I want to do this on the right side of the fabric because it marks the pleats in a specific way. So if you do this from the right side, it'll look like this, and then if you try and mimic that from the underside, it will be going in the opposite direction. And then I'm just going to carry on with this until they're all marked. And I've already done the other white front panel, so now I just have to repeat this with the back pieces. And then I'll have to do it on the denim. And for the denim, I'll be using chalk. I was reading through the instructions, and they want you to sew up the inseam first, or the crotch seam. So this seam right here, which is sort of hard to see with the white fabric on the white table, I shall show you with the denim pair. So they want you to sew this seam together first at the front, and then reinforce that seam, and then pleat the fabric. And in case you don't believe me, here they are in the instructions. Step 1 is stitch center front seam of front 4 sections together. To reinforce seam, stitch again over first stitching. Which just seems stupid to me because it's way easier to press pleats when the pattern or the fabric is completely flat as opposed to there being a seam here. So I'm going to pleat my panels first, and I'm going to start with the pleat that is furthest away from the crotch, and I'm pleating outward from the crotch, just like so. And I'm going to put my first pin right at the bottom of where my top stitching is going to be, and then I'm going to pin upward from that point. And I'm putting my pins far enough away from the fold of the pleat that I can top stitch against the fold of the pleat. And I'm just lining up the markings that I have transferred to the fabric. Very, very easy. And that is one piece pleated down. I guess I will show a dynamo with denim this time. So again, I'm starting with that pleat that is furthest away. And for these, I'm probably actually going to measure and then create a little tick mark where the top stitching should end, just because it was sort of difficult with the chalk to get it super precise, and I want them to be even. And also, I deeply apologize for my chipped nail. Some of you probably hadn't noticed, and now I've made you notice, and it's going to bother you for the rest of this video, but I just had to put it out there and apologize for such a horrible visual that I have bestowed upon you. I'm deeply sorry for my lack of professionalism. So that is another one pleated. I have to change the exposure on my camera, and then I get to repeat this process for the remaining panels. Okay, so perhaps I should have read the instructions first. It looks like they want you to sew these pleats as tucks. So you would actually pin the lines together and then stitch the fabric from the interior at that line. So in this case, you would be marking the pleat placement on the interior. And then after you'd sewn all of them, you would go through and top stitch them. So it says, complete making and top stitching the second pleats on each side of center front in same manner. Complete third pleats in same manner, based across edges of pleats. To make pleat near center front seam on front, on inside, bring broken lines together as shown. Stitch along broken lines, press pleats towards center. Then on outside, stitch front close to pleat seam as shown. So you wouldn't get this effect of actually having the fold of the pleats. You would have something that looks more like a dart. It's actually called a tuck, but tucks don't show up in modern patterns very often. And then you'd just be top stitching along the seam line to create that faux pleated effect. I actually just found one piece that I forgot to pin, so I thought I'd go ahead and demo how they want you to do this. So you take the dotted lines and you would bring them together, and then you would pin through both dotted lines, just like you're pinning a dart, except it doesn't taper. My needles are going through those broken lines on both sides of the fabric, and then I would just sew to that point. I would remove the pins, and then I would press it this way, and then I would top stitch to that point to create the effect of a pleat. And then I would just go through and do that again with the next one. So these really are tucks, not pleats, but it creates the effect of a pleat once it is pressed and top stitched and whatnot. So again, you would just top stitch along that line, and then you would repeat it with the third one. So I haven't sewn these, so they don't look as crisp and sharp as they would if they had been stitched, but that's the method they're suggesting. And for contrast, that is how it is done using a normal knife pleating method, which I've gone for. I don't think either way is better than the other. They end up looking very, very similar. I think the reason they recommend you do it this way is because then there are 2 lines of stitching setting the pleat, so you're not depending on that top stitching to secure the pleat in place. You're depending on that first line of stitching. So I think it's probably friendlier for beginner seamstresses, but it's definitely not the only way to approach a pair of pleated shorts. So I got all of my panels top stitched last night. These are the white ones, which I've gone ahead and pressed. And then over here I have the denim ones, which I haven't pressed, and you can see the difference and how the pleats sit after they've been pressed and before they've been pressed. Though it does actually drape quite nicely even without pressing, which makes me feel good that these might not need to be ironed super thoroughly after they're washed, which would be awesome because ironing is my enemy. Once a project is done, I never want to have to iron it again. So I don't know what footage you've seen so far, but I ended up trying to make a white pair and it did not go particularly well. So basically it ended up being too big because I made some alterations after making my mock-up that weren't reflected in the mock-up. I thought the addition I made was just going to provide a little bit of ease, but it ended up making them way too big in the waist. I also curved the side somewhat to reduce the volume, but having a zipper installed into that side and the curvature made it look really awkward. To fix it, I was going to have to remove the zipper and completely remove the pocket, which I would have been willing to do if I had confidence they would turn out well. But the fabric was also really too thick for this design and it just looked off. So I decided instead I would cut a new pair from a lighter denim. It's lighter both in color and in weight, and it's very similar to the dark denim I'm using as well. It does have some elasticity to it too. Before cutting this out, I made a minor alteration to my pattern. I just folded these side seams inward a little bit. So the waist in total will be 1.5 inches smaller and the sides are straighter, so hopefully they will sit a little bit nicer. And I also made that alteration just by trimming some excess material off the side edges of the darker denim pair. Now that that's done, I'm going ahead and marking the pleating points onto the new pair. I'm going to be following the instructions for this pair and making them as tucks first and then top stitching them down so you can see that process. So I just pinned 3 of the 4 panels of the light denim pair off camera and then I realized I probably should be filming this. So these are being sewn as tucks and then top stitched down to make them look like pleats rather than being sewn as actual pleats. I did film a demo on the white pair earlier about this process, but I'm not sure if that footage is going to end up being included. So this time around I've marked the pleats on the wrong side of the fabric and I'm going to align these 2 markings together and then pin them together in this orientation. And I'm going to be making sure that my pins are going through both markings on either side of the fabric. So that's about 1/8 of an inch off, so I'm just going to shift it a little bit, and now the pin goes through the pencil line on both sides. So I'm going to repeat that at the bottom of the tuck. And once the bottom and the top are aligned, the middle portion should be as well. Right, it's pretty good. So we'll just put a pleat in the middle for good measure, and then move on and repeat this for the next one. And I think they have theirs being sewn one at a time, but that feels unnecessary to me. So I'm sort of following the instructions, but not fully following them, as is usually the case with me. And after these are sewn, they're going to be pressed to the side, and then they'll be top stitched down. That is done. That is what it looks like from the back, and these will be folded to the side once I'm done. And that is what it looks like from the front. So that is where I'm going to be top stitching after it is pressed. So I just went ahead and got the pleats ironed on both pairs, and that was so gloriously easy to do while they were laid flat. I have no idea why you would sew up the crotch seam first. It would make that step way harder. I don't like actively ignoring steps. I don't strive to do that. I just don't want to do something in a manner that is stupid simply because they told me to. And on that note, I'm going to carry on not following their instructions and do the pockets and the zipper installation before sewing up the crotch seam. And because once again, those things are easier to do while the fabric is flat. I actually recut the pocket pieces. Originally they were cut from muslin, but that muslin wasn't pre-washed, so I was a little worried it was going to shrink and distort the shape of the side seam. And I also mainly chose that material because it was very pale, so it wouldn't show through the white pair, but now I'm not even making a white pair, so I can use a slightly more fun fabric like this jellyfish print from Tulip Pink. So they assemble or sew on the pockets in a way that I actually find really intuitive and wonderful. And what they do is just sew either side of the pocket lining to either side of the side panels and sew it on, then flip it out. They edge stitch it, so it'll be more inclined to turn inward, and then you turn it outward and sew the side seam and then around the pocket lining to form the pocket at once. And it's so much easier than inserting a pre-formed pocket into a seam. I just can't recommend this method enough. So I'm really happy to see that they're doing that. And I've done this a couple times before. I think I actually originally learned about it from a Simplicity reproduction pattern. And it's one of those things that I've done pretty much every time I've made a pair of pants that has a pocket in it since then. So it does go to show that there's sometimes pattern instructions can be a little bit silly and, in my opinion, not necessarily worth following to the letter. You can also sometimes learn things from them, which is really fantastic. And that was the case with this. I'm just pinning the pocket lining onto the right side of both the front and back pieces. And I'm only doing this on the right side because the left side is going to have a zipper in it. Now the left side front and back pieces are going to be pinned and sewn together with the right sides facing each other. And I'm going to pin and sew them right below where the zipper ends. So I'm using these zippers. I have two of them and they don't match perfectly, but my zipper stash is running a little bit slim at the moment, so I'm working with what I have. So since this is a metal zipper, I can't just cut off the excess length like I might with a plastic or a nylon zipper. So I have to make sure that the zipper opening is the correct length for it. So I'm just going to align the edges, and then I'm going to align the zipper with my material. I'm going to put a pin right where the zipper ends. And I'm going to sew from that pin down to the bottom edge of the fabric. And then I just have to repeat that for the denim pair, or the darker denim pair. So this is what the pocket looks like now that has been sewn on. So you can see my edge stitching right there, which just secures the seam allowance in that direction and is going to encourage it to turn inward on that line, which means it won't be visible when the garment is worn. So with that done, I can carry on sort of following their instructions. And once again, I've done this before sewing the crotch seam because now I can lay this completely flat. What I'm just going to do is go ahead and lay these pieces over top of each other. And if I had cut the notches into the pocket, then I would align those notches, but I didn't do that. So instead I'm just aligning the edges. And I'm also going to align the edges of the denim below the pocket, like so. And now I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of the pocket. And I'm going to pivot here and sew 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of the denim. And then when this is turned right side out, the pocket will be neatly finished and tucked inward, and the side seam will look like that. So really, really easy way of installing a pocket. I like it a lot, and I use it very frequently on the somewhat rare occasions that I choose to add pockets into my own garments. I have controversial pocket opinions that I'm not going to get into in this video. And for the side that will have the zipper installed, I sewed at the bottom portion of that seam, and then I just pressed it open. And I pressed the top portion that wasn't sewn inward by 5/8 of an inch, and now I'm just going to align the bottom of the zipper up with that opening and pin it to either side of the fabric. I would show you this process on both pairs of shorts, but the zipper I'm going to use for the other pair is actually still installed in the white pair that I've abandoned, so I have to rip it out. And they want you to kind of lap the zipper over. I'm not going to do that just because I find then the zipper is more likely to get caught on the fabric. And I've had a few moments where my zipper has gotten stuck on my pants, and I've thought that I'm going to have to cut myself out of them in order to have to go to the bathroom, or that I'm going to have to make a very embarrassing sort of walk of shame out of the bathroom because I can't get the zipper up. So I don't really like doing lapped zippers. unless it is absolutely necessary. Instead, I'm just going to make the fabric meet at the center point of the zipper, so that will be mostly hidden when this is worn. That fear of zippers getting stuck is part of the reason why I've used a relatively large metal zipper. It's partially just what I happen to have in my stash, but it's also a lot more durable and a lot sturdier than plastic zippers or invisible zippers, so that means it's less likely to break on me. Because given that it's going over my hips, there is going to be some tension on it. Alright, so the zipper is installed, the pockets are done, the side seams are done, so now I can sew up the crotch seam on both sides at once. That is the front, and then this is going to be the back. I also may have sewn the zipper into the wrong side of one of the pairs because I had the pieces facing upside down and I didn't notice, so I got my lefts and rights confused, but you know, that's fine. Maybe some of you out there are left-handed and want to have your zippers on your right side, in which case I can show you how that would look. So now I'm just going to stitch 5/8 of an inch away from that edge, and then I'm actually going to fold the seam allowance over and I'm going to edge stitch that as well, just to create a bit of a top stitching effect. Now the crotch seam has been done up. I folded it to the side and then I edge stitched it, and then I sewed up the inseam with a 5/8 of an inch allowance, and I edge stitched that and I top stitched a 1/4 inch away from the edge stitching. My camera is really overexposed for some reason. There. That should make it a little bit easier to see. Then I tried it on and it's still a little bit too big in the waist, which is annoying, but I think I can fix that by lapping the front piece slightly over the back piece at the pocket point instead of having them meet up precisely. And speaking of the pocket join point, I pinned it shut here and I'm going to try this on, and then I think I'm going to sew the pockets shut, and I will show you why. I'd also just like to document their photo and show that they don't have an image of the pocket sitting nicely. They have a photo of the model with her hand in the pocket. And also the shorts appear to be relatively fitted across the front. So keep that in mind. So these are what the shorts look like on me, and as you can see, the waist is like relatively loose. This is a stretchy fabric, but there isn't a lot of tension being put on it. This is just sort of how it naturally sits, and it almost gapes away from the body at the waist. So I would like to take it in by overlapping this edge a little bit more. But as you can see, there's not a lot of pulling, there aren't any lines, there aren't any signs of strain across here or across the back even. Any wrinkles you see are actually wrinkles of my shirt underneath it. So it's sitting really nicely and relatively tightly, and I'd say similar to the model. But if I unpin the pocket, and yes, the pocket is on the wrong side, that was a little oopsie of mine. Ta-da! Look, how beautiful. Since my hip is curved and there isn't anything holding the fabric straight up, it wants to kind of slope down, and then it reveals the pocket lining underneath it. So if we were, you know, to say take this at an angle like that, the pocket would look absolutely fine, but when I remove my hand and turn to the side, you can clearly see it gaping. It just looks terrible. So I think this will be helped by when the waistband is on and it's sort of pulled up a little bit higher and more in a correct position, but I don't think that will fix it entirely, so I think I'm just going to sew this closed. I also want to say that the pockets for this are really, really small. Like, this is the farthest I can put my hand in it. It's like half my hand. This is like a Samsung Galaxy 7 or something, and that is how it fits in there. It's really a very, very small pocket. So even though it is sort of annoying to be losing that, I'm not losing that much. This still isn't a large enough pocket that I could wear just these and not have to carry an additional bag to hold my phone in. And as you can see, the pleats are sort of getting out of sorts. Like, I don't feel like the pleats are quite deep enough to really hold the shape, but this pattern might also just be made for drapier fabric. So that's where I am right now. I'm going to pin and then sew the pockets shut on both pairs of pants, and then we can sort out adding the waistband. I think when we last left off, I was talking about sewing the pockets shut, and I've done that on both pairs. So that is what the side seam now looks like on the lighter pair, and that is the side seam on the darker pair. I just continued that stitching all the way down. And now it is time to install the waistband. And I've already done this on the lighter pair just because I wanted to kind of troubleshoot it and see how it went together. Now I'm going to repeat the process with a few minor changes on the other pair. And unfortunately, all of those markings that I took great care to transfer onto the waistband piece are now no longer really relevant because I've ended up taking it in at the side seams. And I didn't cut a new waistband after doing that or make those alterations to my waistband pattern. I can just chop off some of the excess length at the straight edge, but it does mean that I don't have the notches to line up on and depend on to get this really perfectly set, which is unfortunate. The waistband is going to be pinned with the right side facing the right side of the pair of the shorts. And I'm going to start 5/8 of an inch away from the edge and pin that to the top of the zipper. So it looks like that when I peel it back. And I'm just going to continue pinning without stretching either the shorts or the waistband all the way around. And I'm making sure when I'm pinning this that I'm pinning the pleats in the proper orientation so they aren't flipping back and sewn differently than I want them to lay. So that is important to keep in mind as you're pinning this. And prior to doing this, I did go ahead and interface the waistband, which they say you should do. So I just used a pretty lightweight fusible interfacing. I was gonna say you can use whatever you want, but they probably do specify what type of interfacing you're supposed to use. I just only have one type of interfacing in my stash right now, so that's what I used. So I have about 2 inches extending past the waistline. I think it's supposed to be more like 1 inch, so it's not too far off. And I'm just going to stitch this on 5/8 of an inch away from the top edge. Alright, so now that is sewn on, and I apologize for the fact that my sewing machine on has been for this entire clip and been noisy. If you've heard any banging in the background, it's because my neighbor is getting a new roof, which has really squashed some of my filming plans for today and the coming week, but that's alright, that's life. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the fabric so the seam allowance extends down, and then I'm just going to fold the waistband half lengthwise and match up the edges. And I'm going to stitch 5/8 of an inch away from this edge, and then 5/8 of an inch away from that edge as well. Repeat this process on the other side, fold it in half so the ends line up, and then I shall stitch 5/8 of an inch away from the edges. And then I will be back once again. So now the one end looks like this. I didn't end up cutting off any of the excess, even though I think it's only supposed to extend 1 inch instead of 1.5 inches, just because I figured it was close enough. So I'm just going to trim the excess material from the seam allowance and then also the excess material from the corners. Now I'll repeat that on this side. Let me look at their instructions really quick, because I think they want me to trim the entire seam allowance, which is what I intuitively want to do as well. So here we are. They say apply fusible interfacing onto wrong side of waistband. We did that. And it says press under 5/8 of an inch on long unnotched edge of waistband. Didn't do that. But this fabric is thick enough and it is also a blend, so it doesn't press particularly well. If I wanted to get that edge really crisp and turned inward, I would probably have to baste it. And then it says with right sides together, pinned waistband to skirt. I'm assuming that applies to the shorts as well. Matching centers, etc., etc. Then it says to stitch on, and then it says trim seam to 1/4 inch. Do not trim seam allowance on left, back, and a waistband extension. Press seam allowance towards band, pressing band out, and stitch across the ends like we did. Then it gets turned inward, and then it says on inside, pin pressed edge of band over seam, placing pins on outside starting at left back edge, stitch close to lower edge and seam, pressed edge of waistband on inside. So I guess I did this part a little bit differently, but it'll be fine. So what I'm just going to do is turn these little bits so they are right side out. And now in addition to the hammering, we have Minnie chewing on a bone in the background, which is just great. So I followed their seam measurements for this. I know I didn't match them up perfectly, but I just want to say that this ends up being skewed. I feel like this point should really extend to here in order to be symmetrical, but as it is now, one corner is lower than the other. I'm not sure what I really did wrong here to make that happen. I'm just going to go ahead and clip this seam allowance down. And I actually neglected to do this on my other pair, and I really regret it, and I will show you why. So I don't know if it's really going to show up on camera, but when a lot of tension is put on it, you can sort of see the line where the seams end. So what you typically do for this is grading these seams. So each one is cut to a different length, and they overlap and create sort of a smooth effect towards the edge, as opposed to all ending at a single point. So that's sort of what they're having me do here, and it's just something that I forgot to do on this pair, and I do regret it because you end up with that line. Now, starting from the edges, I'm going to pin the waistband over top of the raw edge. Now, typically they say that you should line it up perfectly with the line of stitching. So I'll zoom you in nice and close so you can see. So this is the line of stitching where I originally secured the waistband on to the other side of the material. So they want me to put it right over top of that. And then from the right side of the fabric, I'm going to top stitch around the bottom of the waistband. And theoretically, I should catch this edge and properly secure it. But the likelihood of catching it when they are matched up perfectly is a little bit slim. It can be really, really tricky to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pin it slightly past that point, just like a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch past that point. And that's just going to ensure that when I sew from the right side of the fabric, it'll get caught. I'm going to be sewing this from the outside, and to avoid catching the pins in that process, I'm putting them into the fabric vertically like so. So I will be sewing over the pins, but we'll just be sewing it over that way, whereas if the pin was put this way, the foot would get caught by the head. And if you don't want to sew over any pins at all, which is completely understandable, I have an industrial machine, so I'm less worried about it, but it can be a bigger concern with a plastic tabletop machine. Then you could just pin it from the inside and then pin it from the outside and then remove the pins on the inside. Also, another thing to note is if you're making these and this is your first first time really doing top stitching that helps secure parts of the garments together, make sure to do some test stitching on a swatch that is the same thickness as the material you're stitching through. And I just realized I was out of frame for a bunch of that. But when I stitch this edge down, I'm going to be stitching through 4 layers of fabric. You're going to have to adjust the tension and the stitch length to get it to look the same on 4 layers as it does on 2 or 3 like we were sewing on earlier. So if you want all the stitching across the garment to be consistent, then you actually do have to change your machine settings as you do it. I just realized I did a pretty poor job explaining that, so I'm back. So basically the more layers of fabric you're going through, the more thread it takes to go through those layers of fabric, and the shorter the stitches ultimately end up looking. So if you want stitches to look consistent on the hemline as well as the pleats as well as the waistband, then you need to use a different stitch length for each of those because you're going through different quantities of fabric with each of those. So for example, this is a size 3 stitch length on a few different layers of fabric. This is on 1 layer, this is on 2 layers, this is on 3 layers, this is on 4 layers, and this is on 8 layers. And look at the difference in the length of the stitch from there to there and from there to there. So that's why it's so important to play around with the stitch length and the tension when you're working on fabrics you're less familiar with or different thicknesses of fabric, just to make sure that they look consistent all the way across. Especially with top stitching or edge stitching where it's going to be really visible on the garment. And that being said, I've now completed this for both pairs of shorts. I also sewed around the buttonhole placement, so the next step is just going to be slashing the fabric there and then using a buttonhole stitch by hand to work the buttonhole into the fabric. But just before doing that, I've read their instructions on the hem. And their instructions for the hem are press up hem. To finish raw edge, stitch under 1/4 inch on raw edge, zigzag or overlock. Slip stitch hem in place, or if you prefer, stitch one edge of hem tape 1/4 inch over raw edge, slip stitch hem in place. But I really like how top stitching looks on denim, and since we've used it for the pleats or the tucks and the waistband, that's something that I want to mimic on the hem as well. The fabric I'm using is also quite thick. I feel like the fabric they used for the garment on the cover of the envelope is a rayon or something very light, in which case you could easily fold it inward multiple times without it becoming too bulky. But since this is a denim, and also since I want the pleats to hold their shape like this, I don't want to make the hem so thick that it would sort of warp the pleats out of shape. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch across the edge with a relatively small stitch length. Then I'm going to use pinking shears to cut about 1/4 inch away from that line of stitching. So when and if that edge frays, it won't fray as badly because of the pinking. It also won't fray past the stitch point. And then I'm probably going to fold it inward by 1.5 inches or 2 inches, depending on what length I'm going for. I'll do a fitting first to see what I think would be the most flattering. So I've gone ahead and stay stitched a 1/2 inch away from the bottom edge of these shorts. I also did a try on where I just folded the bottom edge inward, and I thought it looked really nice with a 1.25 inch hem, and that is beyond the stay stitching. So what I've done is I've just marked a line 2.5 inches away from the stay stitching, and then I've gone through with pinking shears and trimmed relatively close to that stay stitching. Now starting at these seams, I'm going to fold the bottom edge up until that line of stay stitching is equal with the line I've marked on the interior. And then I will use a vertical pin, allowing me to top stitch over top of it to secure it there. I shall repeat this at the other seam, and then I will just ease the fabric between the 2 seams upward. And the reason you sort of have to be careful with this is because the bottom edge is larger in circumference than the 1.25 inches away from the bottom edge because they do flare outward. So you have to be a little bit careful when pinning it just to make sure that you don't have any puckers or pleats at the bottom edge or anything. That's why you kind of want to pick midway points to pin outward from, because if you just start at one edge and work your way around to the other, you can end up with it looking pretty skewed. Once this is done, I'm just going to press this edge and then I can top stitch it down. Also, while I'm doing this, I just want to give you an ankle update. I can't remember what I said at the beginning of this video, but I did briefly think that I had broken my ankle there. But I think the fact that I can put weight on it and be fine means that it's probably fine. It's just like a sprain that's going to take a little while to heal. And I've been on the internet long enough to know that I don't want photos of my feet out there. Otherwise, I would share one with you because I had quite the gnarly bruise. And what happened was I was walking both the dogs on a waist leash, and it was my second time using it, I think, and I sort of got off balance because they both pulled in the same direction at once. And since they were attached to my waist, I couldn't stabilize myself well. So they pulled me up onto a curb. So I basically rolled my ankle off the curb, and then my shin on the other leg landed on the curb. So that night I was really worried about my ankle at first. And then I slowly became more and more worried about my other leg, wondering if I'd like cracked the bone of my shin or something. But after some ice and rest, everything's feeling much better, so I think I'm okay. But that was not a fun way to spend a week trying to recover from that. And the ankle that I hurt is my right foot. So it's my sewing foot, but moreover is when I'm sewing, there's a lot of maneuvering between tables and walking and standing as you're ironing or pinning like I am now. And that's when it became problematic. So I really haven't gotten a ton of work done just because I've been trying to rest it pretty frequently, and there really is a lot of standing involved with making things. So that hasn't been ideal, but it is what it is. And that is officially the Second time my dogs have tried to break one of my bones. But they're so cute though that, you know, you can't blame them for it. Alright, so I went through and pressed the hem, and then I top stitched 1.25 inches away from the edge, and then I stitched 1/4 inch below that. And I did this just by using the presser foot as a guide as well as the lines on my sewing machine. So after doing that, I pressed the hem again, and then I just repressed the pleats. Pressing is so important, especially when you're making structured garments. This is what it looks like after the pleats have been pressed. And this is what the other pair that hasn't been pressed yet looks like. If you want things to look crisp and nice, then you have to put the effort in when it comes to ironing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for this remaining pair. And then I can finally get those buttonholes done and find a button and get the button sewn on. So I just finished sewing the buttonhole on the other pair, and now I'm going to do it on this pair. So I've already slashed in between the stitching that I made earlier, and now I'm just going to use a buttonhole stitch around the entirety of it. I'm not very good at hand sewing buttonholes, but I'm trying to get better. I have purchased a vintage machine that will do buttonholes to replace my Singer that is refusing to do buttonholes, but I've not yet bought the buttonhole foot to create them, so that is on my list of things to do, and then I have to figure out how it works. And I think I actually will have a video on my new vintage machines coming up soon, because I have bought a couple. They are all pink, and I love them all very much. And they're not all in working order yet, but they will be soon, and then I'll do videos about sewing with each of them. I think I'm going to do like a series where it's like 3 vintage pink dresses on my vintage pink sewing machines, because I have 3 of them now. And I'm just using a normal buttonhole stitch for this, and I'm not getting particularly close up, because as we've already established, my buttonhole sewing abilities sort of suck. If you're just learning how to sew buttonholes and you have a functional machine that will sew them for you, I'd really recommend doing a machine sewn buttonhole and then doing the hand stitching on top. It makes a world of difference. It like basically creates a little cheat sheet for you to stitch around, and they end up looking so much nicer. I've done that on many a project. Now I'm just going back through and doing larger stitches over the ends to make it look more rectangular. I'm having some success at this because it was a pretty crappy looking buttonhole to begin with. Now I'm just going to sew on the button, and to do this I'm going to lap the waistband and figure out where I would like the button to be. Now this button doesn't have a shank, but I don't want to be sewn flat to the fabric because then it's going to struggle to get through the relatively thick buttonhole. I'm also, instead of just tying off the thread, I'm also knotting it through the fabric a couple times because I want to make sure this button doesn't fall off. I feel like that's one of my main issues with store-bought garments, is that the buttons are like really poorly sewn on. Has anyone else experienced that, or is that like a just me thing? Once I've mounted the thread, I'm going to go through my button. I'm going to go through all the layers of the waistband, and using my other hand, I'm just holding the button about 1/4 inch away from the fabric as I'm stitching it on. And I'm going to do 3 passes in each direction, and I'm still holding the button away from the fabric. And then after that is done, I'm going to go up underneath the button, and then I'm going to wrap the thread around the underneath of the button, which groups all of those threads underneath it together and causes the button to stick permanently about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch away from the fabric. So there you can see it's not sitting completely flat. It has quite a bit of space underneath it so it can go through that buttonhole. And then I'm just going to tie the thread off on the other side. If you don't do this, especially if you're using a plastic button, then your button will probably crack when you're trying to get it through the buttonhole. Now this can zip up. The button can go through the buttonhole. We have a nice little closure. And this is how it looks on the white or the lighter denim pair. And now our shorts are done. I'm going to go through and clip any necessary threads. I see one peeking out right here. And then I can try these on and include some photos and film an outro. So that is it for this video, and I'm now going to include a whole bunch of worn photos so you can see these from every angle. And while I share those photos, I'm going to talk about my thoughts on this pattern. So overall, I have pretty positive feelings towards this pattern. I think the finished shorts are really cute. I do think I'm going to get a lot of wear out of them. Though I didn't follow the instructions super closely, so I can't speak to how easy they are to follow. I do feel like this is a simple enough garment to make that there isn't a whole lot that can go wrong, and I think someone who's relatively new to sewing could still construct these and end up with something really great. Even if I disagreed with the order they put things together in, like I feel like doing the crotch seam up first just makes no sense and really complicates the next couple of steps. I do like the methods that they used for sewing the pockets. I like the way they attached the waistband. A lot of it was very intuitive for me because those are the ways I would do those things as well. So I did appreciate that and the techniques that they featured in this pattern. I'd also say this pattern runs very true to size, very true to the measurements on the back. Unfortunately, my measurements don't really align with those. I have a much smaller waist in comparison to my hips, so to get this to fit me, I can't cut a standard size and sew it together. I really do have to make alterations to the pattern, which you saw me do earlier on. Now, my issues with this pattern is that I just don't feel like this is cut in a very flattering manner. I feel like with the way the pattern comes, the pleats are way too close together, and though that would be very suitable for someone from a size 2 through 12, I think for the larger sizes, you really need them separated more. To do that, they would really have to have additional tissue for additional sizes that show the additional pleat placements. So I completely understand why they didn't do that. But if you make this, I really would suggest playing around with adding tissue between the inseam or the crotch seam and where the pleats start, and then removing the same quantity of tissue from beyond where the pleats end. I think you're going to end up with a much more flattering pair of shorts, and it really doesn't change the fit too much. My other main issue with this is whatever happened with the pockets. I'm totally willing to take the blame for that because I did not make them on my mock-up. So for that reason and the lack of seams in this, or the lack of alteration points, I'd really encourage you to make a mock-up first. I'd also really encourage you to make the pockets larger because though I did have to sew these shut and that was a shame, I didn't feel like it was a big loss because the pockets were so tiny to begin with. One other thing, which really isn't the pattern's fault, I think it has more to do with the fabrics that I chose, is that the pleats do tend to sort of pop out of shape when you're moving around or sitting or doing things. They just become a little bit rumpled and they don't lay completely flat. And again, I don't think this is a size thing. I don't think this really has to do with the pattern itself. I think it more has to do with the fact that I didn't pick a very drapey fabric. So the pleats don't have the weight on them that encourage them to hang completely flat. So if you made this out of a crepe or rayon or something lighter, I don't think you would run into that issue, but definitely be prepared for having to keep an eye on the hemline and potentially do some rearranging as you're wearing them if you make these out of a denim or a twill or something a bit thicker and stiffer. On the topic of following reproduction patterns, I do plan on making some homemade blouses to go with these shorts in the future. I already have a couple more reproduction patterns as well as some fabric for them in my stash. So definitely subscribe and stay tuned if that is something you're interested in seeing. And thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to all of you very soon.